Ooh. Yeah, sounds good. Anytime. Yep. And there's someone visiting from another boot camp. Might come in and watch. They're kind of sharing how things are there and here. So it's kind of interesting to see. I'm always curious about how other places do it. Good to talk to them about that a little bit. To imagine that we're always right is, okay, ghost. I guess I gotta hit the. But they made doorknob. Or when just. Okay, sorry for the delay. Hopefully Victoria, let's see, we can this on split screen. Hopefully Victoria can hear me. So just so Victoria knows, there was a miscommunication on this side where we thought Joel was going to do the breakout for both classes, so it would be 1 at 3 and 1 at 4 our time. I guess it's Victoria time too. But that didn't happen, so maybe that'll happen tomorrow though. We're still trying to figure out who's going to be doing the lecture tomorrow for Victoria. So if that does change, I'll try and lock that down and see whether or not we can get that message into your channel so you'll know with enough time. Let me know if the mic doesn't work. I guess I should probably type that as well. Okay. Anyone agree? We will, yeah, okay. Still a little time to get in there. It's always weird. When there's someone typing it. Okay, well, let's see what they say. We have just the loading circle when we click play on that link. Okay. Oh, I guess I have to do my whole. What is going on here? Is anyone else able to load from the Victoria channel? I posted a link. Yeah, just let me know if it. All right, they're good to go. Okay, great. So I'm going to repeat it. Just so there was a mix-up today. That's why we're a little bit late. The message was that Joel was going to do both the afternoon lectures, so we would have had to stagger them by about an hour. That might happen tomorrow as well, but I'll make sure that you are informed in your channel so that you know whether or not your lecture will be at 3 or 4 tomorrow. Okay. Thanks for waiting, everyone. First question I asked, I guess, was if anyone believes that this is true. Like, what is hard? What is hard about CSS? Anyone have any? I think now's the time to vent. Now's the time to talk about it. Consistency. Okay, so that means that when you do something one time and then you try and do that same thing again, you're like, it doesn't really work the same way. But not always, okay. Right, so I would say that CSS, the way we do things in a container might impact the way that things inside of that container behave. So if the consistency is not throughout, where everything has the container with the same styles, then perhaps the things inside will not behave the same. So that's, yeah, I think that's true, and I think that's something we have to be aware of when dealing with CSS, is that we have to make things consistent for them to behave consistently. Anything else? Anybody, are the properties well named? No? No, sometimes you're like, what does this even mean? This doesn't even describe what it seems to be doing. And so you try these things out and you're like, well, that doesn't even, you read the documentation and yeah, maybe sometimes they make bad decisions about what they name things. Or maybe with the web, we always run up against this situation where someone had made a decision 20 years ago and we're still living with it. JavaScript, we're still living with decisions that were made in 1996, right? And we try to improve the languages by adding new stuff, but that doesn't necessarily even help solve the problem, because all we have now is to have to root through the new and the old stuff, right? So yeah, I'd say that that's another reason why CSS can be hard, is because sometimes the properties don't do what they say, and what's the difference between, display versus position versus like what all these properties that you can have on display, hidden, or it can be a block, or it can be inline. Like, that's weird to me, right? So I think CSS is hard for a number of these reasons. And again, we're not going to be able to solve that problem today. We're just going to learn a little bit more about it and then practice, because that's how we get better at these things. So like I mentioned this morning, we're going to go into, we did a lot of sizing today. That was one thing we really talked about a lot about. We talked about the difference between display elements and how they behave when it comes to the size, not just the way that they're sized, but also how they flow in the layout. We also talked a little bit about grids, and we'll talk about grids in more detail today when we get to layouts. And we'll actually try and build a tweeter, at least some of the basic styles for a tweeter, using that grid, so you can see how maybe that would be applied. I think it's nice to try and practically apply some of these concepts, right? Okay, so the first thing is position, and this is how we make things show up in the browser the place that we want them to be. Normally, everything we've done up until this point, things have been positioned based on where they are in, where their HTML tag is, and how they're going to be positioned relative to other things in the document. When we have an H1, and then underneath it we have an H2, the H2 is going to be positioned under the H1 as close to it as it can be, spanning the entire length. We're not actually managing the position of these things, but we can. And these are the properties, the values of the properties, the position properties. So there's actually a position, literally, the property literally position. And, one second, I just want to make sure I can see the chat. Oops. Okay. So the property is position, and the value is one of static, relative, absolute, or fixed. Static is the default. If you do not give something a position, it is static. That's the position for you. And I don't ever really see anyone setting an element's position to static, because that would mean well, maybe the situation where that happens is someone has, maybe some style has been applied to it, and then you want to overwrite that with static again to put it back to where it was before. Probably doesn't happen that much. So I don't often see position static, but I do see position relative, I do see position absolute, and I do see position fixed. So we should talk about how these are different. So static, it just sits there. It's just wherever in the layout you want to put it. All of the stuff we were doing so far, all of that document, it's all static positioned elements. So if we had 4 of them here, the second one here, they're all the same. I just highlighted it because we get into other positions, and this is where things actually change. If I say that an element is relative position, and then I give it a top and left property, which I can't give normally, but I can give to a relatively positioned element, it will take where it was put into the layout naturally, and then offset from that point. That's what we're seeing here, is that normally it would flow in just like this, but as soon as we say position relative and then give it an offset, top and a left offset, it moves 20 pixels in this case. Okay. So that might be useful for something. I'm not entirely sure. I think the position relative does come, the use of that comes forward a little bit more when we're talking about absolute. So we've also got sort of this idea here where an element can be positioned absolute. And that means that we can actually say that it has a top and a left and a right and a bottom. Those are other properties. We get all four of them. In this, we didn't have to set the top, the right and the bottom here because it has a width and a height. And once we give it a top and a left, it will be positioned based on that. Okay. Now, we're noticing an interesting thing here is it's not in the flow of the document anymore, right? Everything has kind of shifted over a little bit based on that. So that's one of the, I'm going to bring up a live example. We're going to actually play with these things, change the values, and see what as they happen. Okay, so then there's also fixed. And fixed has the purpose of maybe just staying where you left it when you scroll. So the situation where this is useful is footers, maybe headers, those types of things where you want to be able to scroll the page, but the menu bar at the top, we always want that to stay, so everything scrolls underneath it. This is something you're going to have to do with Tweeter. You have to make your header bar stay, but the tweets scroll underneath it. So fixed is probably the attribute we would use for that. And fixed is going to work very similar to absolute, except it will not move when you scroll it. Okay. Hey, no problem. Come on in. So let's actually look at these things. Here's my example so that you can play with this, right? You can look in my notes and take a look at this page and see the styles that have been applied. That's this page right here. I'm going to bring that up in size. It has, each one of these things is a container, and in the container there are a number of different boxes, similar to what we had this morning when we were doing floats, right? And this box has a special one, it's called highlight, and that's just so that I can show you which one I'm actually affecting in this, right? It just makes it a little clearer which one we're changing. So with the static layout, I'm actually bringing up the inspector here, we always do that, right? With the static layout, we're going to notice that there is no position property in here. Right. No position property, that's the default. But then we go down to absolute, and we're going to see that this box here, for example, oh, this second one here, which we actually applied an absolute property to, it now has that position property, and this is going to change the way that it is laid out within the natural flow of the document. And by applying the offset, that's actually moving the thing positioned. Well, this is where it gets really confusing, I warn you. Okay, there is an absolute item with a top and a left offset. Now it's up in the corner. But how was it down in the box before? I changed a property. Because there's this weird thing with absolute and relative and how they actually behave together. It sucks. So I said that this container, the thing that I'm putting the absolutely positioned element into, that it is a positioned container. And a positioned container, all that means is that it has a position of relative. Okay, so I'm saying that this container, the one that I have listed here, if I refresh this, it has a position class, and that means that its position is relative. Okay? Now, if I put something in there that's absolute, it's going to position relative to the relative container it's in. This is not intuitive in any way. It's just the way that it is. So again, remember CSS is hard, because sometimes things like this happen. The inconsistency, one of these inconsistencies we're talking about, where hey, I put both of these things as absolute, but one of them is in the container, and the other one is, well, it's up in the top corner of my whole document. Why is that? Oh, well, the thing that's around it, that has to be positioned relatively in order for you to get that behavior to be consistent, right? This is why CSS is hard. Okay? So for absolutely positioned elements, if they are contained within a relative positioned element, a positioned element, then they will position relative to that element. That's the best way that I can say it. Okay? Here's fixed. The difference is we're just changing the position to fixed. Right? If I give this an offset, though, it jumps up here, and it's still, so now, it's still fixed. But as soon as I give it a top and left offset, it's going to be positioned based on where the document, the origin of the document. That make sense? I mean, it doesn't, but it's the way that it is, right? So positioning is going to get you with this. Or you're going to get caught with position sometimes. Because it seems to be that why don't I just absolutely position everything on my page, and I can just tell, like, I know the coordinates I want to put these things. I want this thing to be 300 wide, and that means that I can put the thing that's beside it at 300 left pixels and start both at the top, and everything's going to be great, right? But this is the danger of CSS. It's something that looks easy can often catch you. Something that looks like the easy way to do it, because now I don't have to worry about the flow of the document and where things get positioned based on everything else that's going on. You start making things absolute. Good luck with responsive design. You're going to be positioning everything, so that means that if you want something to move, then you have to also position the element that's, you have to change the properties of the element that's beside it if you want that to move with it. This becomes quite a problem. So I would be careful about using absolute and fixed, because they could get you into trouble. There are use cases that I've used some of these things for building perhaps maybe less web style layouts and more application style layouts. Things like this where I want to maybe drag this thing in the middle, and I can actually just programmatically change the location of these things if I wanted to, right? But then I have to build the responsiveness into my JavaScript rather than through my CSS, and that could be quite a bit extra work. So keep that in mind. I think for fixed, just use it sparingly, but it is useful for things like headers and footers. It can be useful for those types of things. Okay. Any questions about that? No? Please, if you do have questions after, oh yes, good.
Yeah, there's actually one
Yeah.
I kind of found today was
Sticky?
sticky. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, cool. So sticky, let's look that one up, because obviously they're adding these things all the time, right?
It seems to be very similar to UX stuff. I don't know what that means.
A sticky position element is an element whose computed position value is sticky. It's treated as relative. It looks to me like, so based off my quick read of this, and I would probably want to spend some more time before I give you a real sure answer. I've never used sticky. It seems like it will be relatively positioned until we scroll all the way up, and then once it hits the top, it doesn't keep scrolling, it just stays there, stays sticky to the top. I think that's what this is saying, right? It's saying its computed position value is it's treated as relatively positioned. Okay, that's fair. It's going to be relative to where it is in the flow of the document until the containing block crosses a specific threshold, such as setting the top value other than odd. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, it looks like you might not even need to be. It might not be the top of the page. It could just be some. Yeah. Yeah. Something like that. Yeah. Sounds like it. You know, this, I'm not sure when it was added. We can always figure, we can usually find that out by, maybe it tells us at the bottom here. Like we can look at the CSS level 2 here, say that what does this position specify, what are the actual options we can use. I started saying this, that I'm not necessarily the person that should be teaching you CSS, because it's not something that I do day to day. But if you find something like that, the best thing to do is definitely go look at the documents, read it, and then try it. That is what we want to do. We want to try it, right? So, well, let's change the code that we have here. Let's go in and, instead of making something fixed, I don't know, let's see what happens if we say this is sticky instead. Okay, so that's still, let's see, okay, it's still kind of, there might be something we need to do. Is that right? Let's fix the container. Not finding that anywhere. Okay, so it looks like I'd have to set the top value of the containing block, maybe? Saying here that crosses a specific threshold, such as setting the top value other than auto within its flow. How do we do that? If this doesn't work, what we'll do is we'll spend some time afterwards, and then we can send a message out to the group, right? After we've played around with it. You know what else we'll do, because we're already running late?
Yeah.
To come back, we'll do a bit of research right after this and figure out exactly what's going on with it. I like that. Okay, cool. I love it. I love learning these new things, right? This is how I get better at CSS, is having to play with those types of things. All right. So we went over position. Now we're going to talk about specificity, but first we talk about selectors. So these selectors here, these would be different ways to actually select different elements. What is the difference between, so this is a group selector. I'm actually trying to select maybe two things. What's the difference between these two? It's a very slight difference.
The first one is the div, the class primary.
Yes.
And the second one is anything class primary with a single.
Thank you. That's a beautiful way of putting it. Exactly. Does everybody get what that means? Is that in one case we're actually selecting a div with the class primary, and in the other case we're selecting something with the class primary that's a child of a div, or a descendant of a div. So these things act different, even though they look very close, and just by missing that, by putting that space in there by accident, might not work for you necessarily, right? Although chances are it could select that that primary div still just by class, right? Okay. So then we put a series of declarations in there, and that gives us our proper, those are the rules that we have. So both of these selectors, they have a tag or a, what we call it, a type, and then a class, right? We can, if we try and select two things and give them both a value, a property that's the same, how do we know which one should actually be applied? If we say that we have, let's say a P and an article P, that's our example here. We have a paragraph, but we also have a paragraph that's a child of an article. Right now, if we just put those two things in a CSS document, how does it decide which one to actually apply the style for? Well, specificity. The order matters too, right? So if things have the same specificity, the order of the document matters. So if I give something two classes and then put those classes in my document, the one that happens late or after, that's what will actually apply it. Okay, so because those two things have the same specificity, they're both a single class. It has to still break the tie somehow, and so it does that based on the order. The last one that's in the list the last one will get applied. Okay, so we would want to talk about how we can actually harness and use specificity to make these decisions ourselves, so that really necessarily worried about the order that these things happen in, but more so we'll be as specific as we need to select the things we want. So there's, let's say for now, 3 things that go into specificity, and what we're doing is we're creating a value that when we compare it against another value, we can see which one is higher, and the higher value is that's the property that's applied, or that's the style that's applied. In this case, ID is one of the things. So an ID, that is very specific, right? How many things on a page can have the same ID? Just one, right? Unless we're doing something wrong. So that's very specific. And then class is a little bit less specific. And then tag, the least specific. Okay. So if we use a selector that contains just a tag, we have a specificity of, let's say, 001. Okay. And if we use article P, that's 2 tags, we get a specificity of 2. And so 2 versus 1 doesn't really matter where it is in that CSS document. Article P would be more specific than just P. Okay. So if 2 things match, if we match multiple, or if an element matched multiple styles, it'll look up the specificity and determine which one to actually apply. We can have an image, which is a tag, and then 2 classes on it, one called bio and one called rounded. And that is more specific. We have 2 classes, 1 tag. So it gives us a specificity of 21, let's say. More specific than 2 or 1, right? And then we have the ID, which is the most specific. It's going to give you a specificity of 100 if you just have an ID. Again, more specific than 2 classes and a tag, even though there's only one way that we're identifying it, but it's more specific, so it works. Then you can actually combine these things and do a tag and a class and an ID if you want. And you get 111. So these numbers, whatever the highest, you can kind of think of it as a 3-digit number, although it's not base 10, so it can go past 11, 12, 13. You can have 1, 13, 12 if you want, and that would be more specific than 1, 12, 13. Okay, let's do a little test here. Get interactive a little bit more, right? First one on the list, div.warning p. So I can always come back to this, right? ID, class, and tag. Div warning p. What would be the specificity of that selector? Well, okay, so how do we get to that? One class, yeah. So no IDs, one class. Cool. Yeah. So that is, yeah, that has a specificity of, let's say, 12 for argument's sake. What about the next one? Sorry? So how many IDs are there? Okay, 1. So that automatically makes it more specific than our previous one, right? And then we have how many classes? 1. And then how many tags? Right, so 1, 1, 2, right? That's what we get here. Then we have just P, so that is great. And the last one. Great. So which is the most specific? Second one, exactly. The 112 is the most specific. It's slightly more specific than 102. So does this make sense? Yeah? Okay. There's some, this is the one. There's some great documents out there. I've got it in my notes as well. So in my notes, we go down to specificity, hit this here, and you get to play around with this cool kind of thing, right? It's like this, this Shining-based specificity document. It kind of tells you that, and I didn't go into some things, like universal selector, for example. I didn't talk about that. I didn't talk about pseudo classes, okay? And I didn't talk about, well, those two I will talk about. Class attribute kind of stuff. So I went pretty basic on it. We can go a little bit farther if you want to, but the rules sort of apply across the board, and they just have each thing is worth a little bit, different level of has a different level of impact on the specificity. Okay, down here we've got the most important stuff, which is inline styles and this important tag, which actually gives you like 5 layers of specificity. So this morning I mentioned style tags are more specific, right? So we can use those, and then specificity doesn't matter as much, right? You just apply that property to that tag, and there you are. There you go. And then you've also got this concept, and so remember I said be careful with those, because as soon as you do that, it becomes difficult to overwrite that style. You have to use something like important to do that. You can actually give any of these properties the exclamation mark important kind of characteristic, and that's going to mean that it overwrites even if the specificity is more on something else, right? So if you just put important on everything, it's going to cause issues for you, because not everything is important, right? What's important once everything's important? Nothing. All right. Cool. So does that feel good? I mean, it's been a little while since I've done this one. So we feel okay with the specificity and position? Okay, cool. This is where I wanted to spend some time, because I feel like the practical application, now we start to see like how do we actually use this stuff? So this is a grid layout. And I don't know if I'm going to be able to convince people that these things are really useful. It took me a little while to get on board, but working with some designers, and then they started to deliver designs using grid, and I'd go and look at these Photoshop documents, and they would actually, you just click like the visibility layer on their grid, and you can see everything is aligned within a grid like this. All of the images and paragraphs and everything, they just position it based on, and you think that sounds pretty easy. Design is something we can learn as well, right? So if we can build a grid like this, then we can put together most of these layouts that we're dealing with today, or that we want to use today. And a grid is basically, the most common one is split into 12 columns, because it gives us the most options in terms of, we can have, well, every column at the top here, every column is a value of 1, right? So it only, everything we can say, this only takes 1 column worth of space, whereas we could actually have 6 2-sized columns. We could have 4 3-sized columns, 3 4-sized columns, and 2 6-sized columns, a 12-size, something that spans the whole thing if we want. So when we define our styles, we apply, when we apply the styles to this, we decide how big do we want this column to be, okay? And this is where it becomes kind of useful. Let's say we want to build a layout like this, right? So we go from this column, or this column-based kind of 12 columns, into a layout that would be more familiar to us, where the header spans 12. And then we go to a new row below it, and that has a 3-column span and a 9-column span. And then at the bottom there, you got 3 3-column footer columns, whatever, right? And you don't have to have these gaps in there. You could make your background the same color as whatever, and it won't even look like there's a gap. But in a grid, there usually is a gap between each column. You can set the size of that too if you want. Okay. So, you know what? I forgot to. I'm just going to show you quickly. I don't think I need to go through it, but there's this document here about specificity, and it just shows that just kind of, you can play around with it here and test those theories out with it. So I won't go into that because it's, I think, much more useful for us to spend the time on this grid stuff. So here is a grid file, and actually I'm going to load this up. It's right here, and as I can kind of drag it in and out, and those things are based on percentage widths, so they're growing and shrinking as I change the size of this. Now down here we see that same representation, let's bring it up in size, right, of a navigation, a sidebar, content, footer columns, all that stuff. And still, you know, it still sizes relative to the window size. There's no height, so obviously we don't get that full layout that we're looking for. What we can do is, anytime we have this grid system, we get to create layouts like this. This one uses a file called grid.css, and I created that beforehand because I'm not one to write grid systems from scratch. I mean, there's so many different ways to do it. Even this one I iterated on a number of times, looked up other people's, looked at bootstraps and foundations, and looked at their implementation. Said, like, how could I make this as simple as I possibly could? And of course, in doing and trying to make it simple, I also have stuff like this in here, which is going to be new to you, right? But really, what we're doing here, remember this from this morning, div.row, overflow hidden, or auto, or something like that, right? We can say that we're going to have these rows, and so my I got to run my HTML. So there's a grid here. I have a row, and in that row I have 12 one-size column elements. 1, 2, 3, 4, right? And then in my next row, and then in my next row, and my next row, and my next row, and then I get down to my container that actually has all of my layout in it. And in there, I just still have rows and rows and rows. And inside of here, now it gets a little bit interesting. I'm able to say that this class here, it's my sidebar. It has a column width of 3, and maybe a sidebar class as well that changes its color. And then the thing beside it, directly to the right of it, it also has a size. I want it to be 9 columns wide, so I can set that here. And this is how we might use a grid system. And this is where I expect you to sort of stop for this week, right? Is know that these things they're not like anyone can create them. They're not just for people that create Bootstrap, although that's what it seems like sometimes. In this case, we should be able to learn how to use a grid without necessarily even having to implement one ourselves. And this is sort of the patterns that we might see when using a grid. All right, so we had that row. And what does the row do? Why do we have that? Why did we put a row in this morning? It's our columns. Remember, to get these things to get horizontal layout, old school horizontal layout, we need to float elements, right? Yeah, it's frustrating. This whole thing ends with just use flexbox by the end. By the way, so this is kind of cool though, because I'm showing you here that although I have all these columns specified here and saying that this column here is 8.33. Why is it 8.33? Why is it 16.66 for 2? And why is it 25 for 3? It's a fraction of 12, exactly. So we calculate this first, and then we build the styles based on that fraction. If you were building a 16-column grid, you would come up with different values for this. So I just went through and I calculated what these values were, and I put them in for each column. Okay, we can do this with SAS if we want to. We can, which is something built on top of styles that allow us to generate stuff like this programmatically. It's a little bit nicer. So most of the modern grid systems probably use something like that. You won't see this a lot anymore, where they're actually putting each value in independently like this. But also, I want to say that every single column, not only does it floats, and it also has a right padding of 20 pixels. That gives us that gutter, right? But it's kind of cool because I can say that I want all of the classes that match this pattern to have these properties. So I didn't have to actually repeat float left and padding, float left and padding, float left and padding. So with CSS, you can do selectors like this as well, which are kind of like wildcard or matching style selectors like that. Okay. I want everything to have a right padding except for, let's see what this looks like. Remember, we can always bring this tool up and see what there's padding, there's padding, there's padding, there's padding. Oh, that one doesn't have padding, right? So another cool CSS thing is I can use like these sort of pseudo things to say, actually, the last one in the list of these things, it will have a padding of 0, and I'll overwrite that value. And so that's why we end up with padding applied to everything except for the last one in the list. And that's consistent across the board here. Right? This has padding, but this has no padding. This has padding, this has no padding. Maybe you want gutters on the sides. That's cool. Give your page maybe give it a margin, or give the container some padding to push things in. Whatever you want to do with that, right? But I just want to kind of call out some of these cool things we can do with CSS if we push it a little bit farther. So this is the most basic grid I could come up with. And in my grid HTML, I have a few other things. So this is no longer grid style, but I'm using some of these cool things composed together here to say, for example, every odd child has a background color that's this gray, and every even child has a background color that's a slightly different gray. That's how I'm getting these alternating column background colors. So, does that make sense a little bit? Okay. Now, what about this layout? Does it look familiar yet? Okay. No, I wasn't quite sure if I should do this one before you do the assignment, because the way that the assignment has you build this layout is not through a grid system. And that's actually why I felt like it's okay, is because you can't just copy and paste my code without maybe learning a grid. That'd be cool. Or you come up with another way to do the same thing, and we see that there's many ways to do the same thing in CSS, right? So this thing, it's a multi-column grid, 12-column grid again. I can get that kind of behavior. The thing in the middle, though, does not have a minimum width now. And I think the requirement for Tweeter is that it does, right? So maybe you won't get exactly what you're looking for with that. This layout, it starts by using normalize, so we're going to make sure the style sheets are consistent across all browsers. Cool, we've talked about that. And then also, got this grid here. So I'm importing that grid file, the same one that I used from that other file. I'm using it here as well. It's the same code. It's just this, no magic, right? That stuff we just went through. And after that, I'm going to apply my own styles just for this document. This is actually normally how I would do it. I wouldn't have my grid stuff mixed in with my more specific styles, the things that say that this thing should be a gray background, the thing that this should be a white background. The grid does not care about that at all. And so I'll import the grid here, and then I'll use it in my application by creating a row, and the header, it's actually 2 different columns. We can inspect that and find out why that would be. Why do you think I would break this into 2 columns? No idea? Yeah. And so I think it just makes it a little bit easier for me to do it that way. You probably still get it working another way. I didn't use you'll notice that I did not use a float for my button to make it go to the right, which is the common solution for people doing this exercise, right? So, and typically they'll float right. And what does float do to our container? Yeah, it means that it will not react to the sizing of the element. So we might need to maybe set the height of the thing, right? In this case here, what is the height of our row? It's the amount of space necessary to fit this. I could also give it a height property and set it to what I want it to be, right? Okay, so we got 2 columns here, and then after we have those columns, we give ourselves another row here, and that's going to be the bottom part of our layout. And this thing here has a sidebar with that gutter, that padding, right? And then it has a column, has its own padding as well. And then there's the other sidebar, no padding. It's the last element in the list. And so, again, as we resize this, the percentage change, the actual pixel size will change, the percentage will stay the same. Does that make sense? Okay. So any questions sort of about how this stuff works? I think I could definitely go through any of these styles, but I invite you to take a look at this even after you build this yourself and compare the 2. Right? That's a good thing to do, is build it yourself and then compare it to something else that's very similar, and then figure out what the differences are, learn about those differences. That's next level.
So would you, if you were doing a grid layout, would you not want to do fixed width elements?
Normally you wouldn't.
Like, for example, that mid thing.
Yeah.
Could you still use a grid layout and somehow?
And still set it.
That?
I mean, you could. You could. I think you could. The thing about grid was sort of on the way to more responsive. So you can say that I have all these columns, and then if I run out of space, you could actually have those columns be stacked vertically instead of horizontally. So that's kind of nice. As you scale down the page, they might get smaller, but then eventually you break down to the next page because your mobile device, you might be stacking them instead. So maybe that a fixed size wouldn't work for us anymore, right? That's one a lot of people talk about mobile first design because it's actually easier for some people to design for the mobile device and then scale up afterwards, right? And I think that if you're going the other way, you might think, oh, I'm going to make this thing 600 pixels wide, and then you put it on a small screen device, and you're like, now I have to make all the stuff that fits in there work as well, and that can be an issue. So I think thinking about all possible screen sizes from the beginning helps make those decisions for us. Sorry I didn't answer it perfectly. I don't know exactly. I can't think of a good...
That makes sense.
Okay.
Basically, if you're going for a responsive layout, like, go all the way with responsive.
Yeah, and Friday is going to be more in-depth on responsive. So we'll talk about SAS and responsive design. That's when we'll be able to spend some more time on it. Yeah, cool. Thank you for the question. Anybody else? No. Yes, of course.
Yeah, you did talk about the box model this morning.
Mm-hmm.
Margin border padding. All this does move our content somehow, so I guess when you decide how to position your content, like how do you decide between all these? It's a bit vague.
Okay. Well, so one thing I made sure to do at the top of my grid here, right, so this helps, I think, a lot with that problem, the box sizing, that I can say that this element is this width, And then as the border and the padding and that grows, it doesn't actually really affect the stuff outside of it, only the stuff inside of it, yeah. Whereas if you do content box, then as you grow the padding or the border, the stuff outside of it will move around as well. And so that those things, I think this is one way to help with that issue, yeah, yeah, yeah. When it comes to, I'm pretty much, with this grid, I'm pretty specific on where I want things to be positioned, right? I'm saying that this thing here is in this top corner of this column, and it spans two of them, so it's going to be a width of, I guess it was 16.6%, right? So, and this element next to it is going to be positioned beside it because that's where it's going to exist in the grid. Inside of here, though, we can put things inside of these columns and position them where we want to. We can actually put subgrids in there if we want and continue to break it down more. Or you could use other types of positioning for that. Is that okay? Yeah. Somewhat. I mean, not really, right?
Well, it takes some experimentation.
It does, yeah.
I do understand why this grid system is.
Okay, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard for me to sell it because without actually having gone the other way and having experience not being able to lay out with a grid and then going to it.
Well, it's a lot more structured than just eyeballing it and figuring out the numbers.
Yeah, and that starts to become, that's sort of like the naive way to do CSS, right? It's like I'm going to eyeball it, I'm going to make this thing 13 pixels, and I'm going to make this thing 27 pixels. And it's because it looked right, not because of any sort of form and function or style guide, right? Working professionally, it's normal that you would have someone who delivers you a design that was grid-based from the beginning. And if that happens, then you want to use a grid to continue that paradigm, right? You want to actually continue down that way of thinking. Because if they're designing based on a grid, then you should be implementing also probably based on a grid, just to make your life easier. And then I don't think, then having to nudge things 2-3 pixels just to get it to look right, they've designed it to fit this grid. You've built it to fit that grid. You should have less of that. But then getting into pixel pushing can be one of the major ways to decide you no longer want to do front end development, right? Someone sit next to you and say, okay, can you move this over 2 pixels? Can you move this up 2 pixels? That kind of stuff can become quite a nightmare. So we've talked about floats and grid-based layouts, and there's a better solution. It's Flexbox. Like I said, that's how this thing ends. It's Flexbox. So Flexbox is used for layout across one dimension, and you can nest Flexbox design. So you can actually have maybe a number of different elements that are flexed vertically, and then each of those elements inside of them have things that are flexed on that other dimension. So you can combine two one-dimensional Flexbox implementations to get a multi-dimensional implementation. But I would say Flexbox is really good for stuff like this, where you have maybe a header and you want all your elements to maybe have the same space between them. Maybe the sports thing should go to the end, the music should be right in the middle, and the news should be right on the left. Flexbox helps us with this, and so it's really worth learning Flexbox. I think for your midterm project, we wouldn't worry about it. Again, final project, use Flexbox if you're going to be doing CSS. It's really worth it. And you go into the industry, you should know Flexbox going in. Working with people that are still using floats for these things, I feel like we've failed because we did not make it clear that float is not really necessary anymore. This is grid. This is the new, right? It's pretty fun. I watched a great video about this, and the guy just really pumped me up on grid. But again, these come from designers getting more involved in the web, right? Starts off as scientists, and they're like, we need to share documents, and they don't give a shit about how things are laid out, really. They're used to their headers, they're used to their paragraphs, they're used to all that stuff. But they're not used to designing on a grid, so they don't care. But then designers get involved, we start building products. Products need to be well designed to have a competitive advantage, and so we need our tooling to also satisfy those requirements. So I would say that Flexbox comes from frustration through the older style, and grid comes from a little bit of frustration saying, well, we need 2 dimensions to actually do the layouts we do today, right?
So would you recommend us using grid or Flexbox?
Learn Flexbox first. It's more common. It has a higher level of implementation in the browsers, but only slightly. Like grid, we're there soon. Like I can start talking about grid the way I talk about Flexbox pretty soon. Remember we went in this morning, caniuse.com, and we checked out Flexbox, and we saw that it has quite a high usage, right? And then I do the same thing for grid, and I look CSS grid layout. We're not far behind, but I would still say Flexbox is something I would recommend. And you know what? It's worth learning because it's still good for one-dimensional layouts, right? Like it's not like, well, now I only use Flex even for the times that I want a one-dimensional layout, or I only use grid even the times that I want a one-dimensional layout. That doesn't make sense to me. I'm going to use the thing that makes that is sort of built for that purpose. Whereas I think Flexbox is not really made for multi-dimensional layouts. Really good for single-dimensional layouts. I'd use, if I could use anything, I would choose grid for multi-dimensional, probably the stuff that you saw me doing, and then I would use Flexbox to do horizontal or vertical laying out of things, perhaps. Right? Yeah, there we go. Questions? How do we feel about that? Okay. Still so much more, right? But you don't need to know much more to do this project. That's kind of cool. And again, just like with everything, we learn a little bit, add more onto it. Maybe we'll never need to touch it again, so we can focus our time elsewhere. Yeah.
Not really related to this project, like, will we, because we saw demo day, like the final design
Yeah.
project.
Yeah. Yeah.
Will we learn more CSS or HTML throughout the course, throughout the program, or it's just basically like we can make it as fancy or as functional as we want based on our own research on CSS and HTML, or is it like a deeper? Like,
It's a good question. So the question for Victoria is, what will we learn more about CSS as we go through this program? Or we saw the final projects and they had different levels of styling, right? And I think the question was it mainly will we learn more about this stuff?
yeah,
Or okay, yeah. So the opportunities to learn more about this, next Wednesday you're going to have a presentation on your midterm, before your midterm starts, all about planning a project. One of the things, the key messages, it's, just bring this up in a second. So we've got some time because we've only had 45 minutes, right? Yeah, that's good. Week 4. And then here is the midterm. So if I was presenting the midterm to you, we'd say, we'd get to this slide. We'd say, yeah, we've taught you some CSS, but definitely not enough to do it on your own. So here's some help, right? It's these frameworks that you can use out there. And I don't want to say only use frameworks. I don't want to say only use vanilla CSS. But using a combination of the two is what makes sense to me, especially for the midterm project, especially for the final projects. You're going to see material UI designs. I think one of the projects used material UI, which isn't on this list. We haven't done React yet, which we'll do in week 6, but there are React libraries that use the styles from a CSS framework and give you a set of components that have those styles in them. This is what I would expect for you to do in your midterm project and your final project, is learn some CSS, learn what we've talked about today, maybe some Flexbox. Think about choosing one of these things and then using it and deciding if you like it or not. And if you don't like it, choose another one the next time. And if you don't like that, maybe choose another one the next time. And maybe by going through these things a little bit, you'll eventually find one you really like, right? That's why I don't like to give recommendations on these. The ones that I've used Bootstrap. I stay away from it now. Semantic UI I liked quite a bit. I haven't tried Bulma, but people say it's pretty cool. And the way that I decide whether or not I like it or not is I have to use it on a project. I don't really get no one can tell me because we all have different opinions, right? So I hope that answers the question in the sense that we're going to do a little bit of SAS and stuff on Friday, but your midterms where the person who does the CSS is going to spend a lot more time than everyone else. And same with the final project. Whoever does the CSS on those projects, they're going to get a lot more exposure to CSS. that's why I told you that I don't necessarily like the horizontally splitting project where one person does UI, one person does routes, one person does database, because I feel like you lose. That means that one person gets good at database, one person gets good at CSS, one person gets, and that leaves others at a disadvantage. You can knowingly make that decision and say, yeah, I'm not interested in CSS, so someone else take care of it for me. Great. As long as you never have to apply for a job or do a job that needs that, then you can get away with it, right? And the same is for SQL. Next week, if I teach you SQL, it'll be, we're going to spend 1 day on this, maybe 2 days, and then you're going to jump into your midterm projects. So the person that spends the time on SQL is the one who's going to get a week's worth of SQL instead of 2 days worth of SQL. Because then we jump into abstractions on SQL, like ORMs for Ruby, where we don't even write SQL queries anymore. We don't write database queries anymore. We just use objects and pass them around. When deciding the work, choose what you want to get better at, and then focus the work around that. I think that's the most important thing for the midterm is figure out what you want to spend more time on, and then try and split the work up that way. And hopefully your group is happy to oblige you if you're the one who wants to do all the CSS, right? I think 3 of 3, 3 and 1 of 2, is it? Or, no, 3 of 2. 3 of 2. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, that sounds like that's what it'll be. Try and keep them 3 or 2 or 3 people. Ideally, it's 3, but the numbers didn't work out this time. And of course, the scope of the project we expect as much as the size of the team necessarily, right? If there's one more person on the team, we expect a little bit more than if there's 2 people. It's not that everyone has to do the exact same. And the midterm project is about learning these technologies, but more than that, it's about learning to work as a group. That's the biggest challenge of the midterm project is group work. And we've had groups that didn't work well together and got angry at each other and blamed each other. And if we can figure out how to avoid those situations, midterm project's a success. No matter what the CSS looks like at the end of it, no matter if we've gotten through that and everyone has been has learned some things and they've supported each other in that, then to me that means a midterm project is a success. Oh no, yeah.
Yeah, that kind of runs counter to everyone doing what they're good at. Right? Let's say you have someone really strong at CSS,
Yeah.
someone really strong at JavaScript, right? How do you find the balance there?
Yeah. So a question for Victoria is, horizontal splitting leads us to allow our strongest people to work on the things they're good at, and that means that you'll get a better project. And I just said just now that actually the quality of the project at the end isn't the most important thing, and I think that's true when we're talking about this type of splitting, where if you are the strongest person at CSS for your midterm, don't do CSS for your midterm. There's no point. Let someone else who maybe is trying to figure out that, and code review for them. Review their code and tell them how you would do it differently. Help them because you're better at it than them. Go work on the database because maybe you're not very strong at that. And then the person who's good at the database, who's working on CSS, they should review your database code, and you'll help each other doing that. Don't try and stack the team to get a better project for your midterm. It's just not worth it because the people that need to learn things they need to learn don't get the opportunity to do it. It's such a short timeline. I mean, do what you want, but my recommendation is try not to stack it like that. Try and do the work that you're less familiar with, even if it feels like you're going to fail at the end and not have something to show. I think the midterm is all about work together, help each other, and it's all about learning. The product at the end of it is it's like way down here to me. Some people very rarely some people don't have something to show, and it's usually because of that they had internal conflict rather than they just weren't very good at it. They got distracted by all the politics and saying, well, I want to be doing this. I'm the best at CSS. I should be doing CSS. But I want to learn CSS, and I'm not very good at it. Well, how do you resolve that conflict? Ask me. I'll come in and I'll tell you who's doing what, because I feel like the learning is more beneficial than just practicing what you're already good at. Final project, you do what you can to make the project look as good as possible for the employers. Then you could stack if you want. I still like the idea of having the people that want to get better at things, have them do some of the work and review it. Like that's going to happen on the job too, right? If I'm working with someone and they're not very good at something I'm good at, I would like to review their code, and they would like me to do that. And that's the same type of process you should do in your midterms and final project. Hope that's good for Victoria too. I know it's kind of outside the scope of this, but I think, yeah, that was that. I will send out these notes. I think these ones are worth reading since we have a little bit less time, and I did skim through some things and take a look at the examples, and they're just all indexed, or they're just all in HTML files, so you can just, you don't even need a server, you just load them in your browser, and then you can bring up this console and play with them. Very, very useful to do that. Okay. That's it for me.
This Twitter project is a lot more front end.
The Tweeter project is majority front end. So today we do CSS. Tomorrow we're going to do, in the morning, it'll be vanilla JavaScript to manipulate the DOM. So just pure browser JavaScript to, and it's browser-based JavaScript, not Node JavaScript, things that we don't have access to in Node. We'll use them in the browser to add new elements. We select elements and append elements and modify attributes on existing elements. We can do all that stuff with JavaScript. So the morning is going to be about client-side JavaScript. The afternoon, we're going to use a library called jQuery to do pretty much the exact same stuff we do in the morning, but again with a library that helps us maybe abstract that a little bit, make it a bit easier. But then we need to think about the order that these things were created, because jQuery came out in around 2005, 2006. And a lot of the functionality we're going to use tomorrow morning, that is directly a result of people saying, well, jQuery is so useful, why don't we have some of this stuff built into the browser? So then they add it into the browser, and it becomes, this is the new stuff. jQuery hid all the complexity of doing this in older browsers from us. But we do teach the vanilla first, and then try and do the same thing with jQuery. And then for your midterm project, you'll use jQuery as well. But for Tweeter, you'll use jQuery, and you'll do, on Wednesday, you're going to start making requests to a server using something called Ajax. An Ajax request, which is built into jQuery as well. And so you make a request to the server, and instead of the page reloading, you just retrieve data, maybe some JSON data. And that data, you can then manipulate the DOM based on that. You can change the layout using jQuery, insert your elements, and have the page update as a result of that. So CSS today, tomorrow's client-side JavaScript. Wednesday's making requests to the server using client-side JavaScript. Thursday is MongoDB. So now we go a little bit away from the front end, and we start thinking about the back end, because we're starting to think about persistent data storage. So that would be Thursday is MongoDB. It'll be one solution to persistent data storage, which is we'll switch the server over from using hard-coded JSON value or files to a JSON data document store, which is MongoDB, and then your data gets saved. So when we restart the app, all those changes are retained. And then Friday, SaaS and responsive design. And then next Monday is databases, SQL relational databases. Tuesday is using Node to interact with those databases. And then Wednesday is your midterm project already. So that's kind of the next week that you should be ready for. Yeah. Okay. Actually, I'll just call this out in my notes here. Where did I put it? Oh, that's where. So in here, these are the topics that were not covered in day one. Pseudo elements, pseudo classes, animations, transforms, media queries, and then this document called Common Use Cases, which is actually just a direct link to a whole bunch of other stuff you can learn about CSS. Everyone should get used to reading documentation. It's necessary. It's the only way I can get my job done. Right? No one taught me all this. I read about it. Okay. And the same for you. I can't teach you all of it. You have to teach yourself through these documents. Any questions? One, some, all of you, let me know. Message me on Slack. I'll send these notes out. If you find errors, please let me know. Feedback, go to me or Davey, remember. And either anonymously or direct, it's fine. I just like to know. Yeah, and then yeah, So if you're gonna get into Flexbox, I put at the bottom of my notes here. Learn Flexbox and Flexbox Froggy. That's gonna get you to use pretty much all the properties that you'll need for Flexbox. And so yeah, you'll start off. This thing here has a display property of flex, and then it tells me a little bit about this thing called justify content with all the possible values, including flex start, flex end, center, space between, space around. These are all different ways for Flexbox to manipulate that single dimensional layout. Yeah. Yeah, cool. And then once you've gone through this whole thing, you should have been exposed to every single property that, or at least for the most part, the properties you need for Flexbox. And then I think you're going to be using a CSS framework for your midterm project. So Flexbox may not be something that you need to use for that. But I think we all know Bootstrap, right? I think one of the big differences between Bootstrap 3 and 4 was that they switched from float-based layout to Flexbox-based layout. I believe that is a major difference between the two. That they said, okay, well now it's out there enough that our Bootstrap can use this newer, like still multiple years old, right? No questions from them. Right. So, got the notes here.
CSS tricks.com that you showed us.
Yeah.
The guide to Flexbox.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. I've read that as well. Yeah. That's what I use for reference when I'm building my own sites. When I'm using Flexbox and I have to put together flex styles, I use the CSS tricks reference quite a bit. Because it tells me, not only does it give me a text description of what space between or space around means, but it actually just shows me an image of it. And I identify that with a little bit better, right? So I will submit these notes. See, that's not easy.
Just for the
You okay?
Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes I do that and it sounds worse than it is, and sometimes it doesn't sound as bad as it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that link works.
Oh yeah, do you want to check out?
Yeah, I want to take a look at that. What I'm gonna do. Okay, so notes should be out now, and let's see, sticky.
As I first found out about it, and then I'm trying to fix those headers.
Mm-hmm.
And there's sticky if you take it back, so it's like this.
Yeah.
I think it was something else in the middle of the document. Probably that.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah, that's kind of cool. Oh wow, I love that. Okay, so what's the CSS look like for this? So the DT here. DL. So DL is.
these three will just set up.
Oh, there. That's interesting. So here, this has a top of negative 1px. That's probably the thing that. Let me I can't change any. Oh.
There's a section. Yeah, there's a section with a space there.
There. Okay, so here we've set this thing to sticky, and it doesn't do anything, right? But then here, oops. Now when we put top of negative 1 pixels, that's that threshold I think that it was talking about, right? Now it hits that. So I just put in here.
Yeah.
That's.
Okay.
So when it hits that, I guess that's. Now what happens if we say top 20? Oh no. Top 20. Now once it hits that threshold of 20 pixels, that's where it's going to stop.
Well, I think -1 is just basically the same colors, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you could also get 0 in there if you wanted. And then this.
Technically, -1 is off the speed of 1 pixel, right?
Yeah.
So it's just 1. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, once it goes off by 1 pixel. Now this is 0, so but negative 1px, maybe there's a I'm not sure why they chose that specifically. Seems to work pretty much the same as 0.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's this so this would be the difference between the fixed, is that there's a threshold that has to be met
Right,
for
so you could set a threshold, whereas with fixed, basically it's exactly yeah, right, when I say it's exactly the same setting as the top position pixel. Right, because fixed
Yeah, but it also has to be there positioned first, whereas this one it will not be sticky until it hits that threshold, right? Like A right now, yeah, is laid out naturally, and then hits that threshold. Sorry?
Is that 20 pixels? Or?
It's set to -1 right now.
Okay.
So right now, A moves, B moves, right? Or C, there's no B, but C moves. C is kind of acting like it's static right now.
Yeah.
Until it hits that threshold, then it becomes fixed, like that. So I guess that's the difference with sticky. Yeah, kind of, yeah, it seems like it, yeah. I'm gonna look more into that because that's I'm gonna, you know what I do is I ask my friends who do this stuff, like, have you ever used sticky for anything, and if so, what did you use it for? Because I would love to have, I love concrete, like these examples of where people in the real world had to do it, because, and it's probably something like this, right? Like this is a good example of where you want, kind of like that iOS. When I'm scrolling through my contacts, it tells me what's the, well, that's a great feature, and this looks like that's pretty easy to implement. If I had to do this in JavaScript and jQuery, I could do that, but it would take a lot of code that's executed as well, right? And sticky kind of as a CSS property. That's the other thing that I've noticed is as I've gotten a little bit better with CSS is that I've had to do less and less of my stuff in JavaScript, and I can just let CSS do the stuff that it's good at and it's fast at, right? Because I don't want it to parse and execute JavaScript if it can just use the native code that's in the browser to render and optimize and all that. Right? Cool. Thanks for bringing that up, though. I think it's good. Yeah.
Thanks for looking at.
Anytime. That's what I love about this is no one knows everything, and so I always get to learn more stuff. Anyone else want to talk about anything? Yeah, it is. It sucked to read.
It's still hard for me to understand a lot.
It's a lot. Yeah, with the documentation on MDN, with CSS, that's going to happen, and then you have to play with it. And with CSS, it's often a good idea to start up a blank HTML file and try and build just the small thing that you want to build, independent of everything else that's going on in your site. Figure out how that should work. Figure out whether or not you're adding properties that you don't need. Because sometimes that happens. You make it work, and then you add this property that negates this other property, and then now you don't need that first property anymore, but you're still having your styles because you're afraid to remove things.
Yeah.
It's really good to kind of break it down to very simple, try and get it working in a simple environment, and then try and take that into your more complicated. And that's not just true for CSS. It's like true for programming in general. Anything. It's like, oh, I need to learn how to use this library. Well, instead of just taking it, embedding it in your application, and then having all that complexity come along with it, it's like, well, how would I use the very basic, this library at its very basic level? How do I slowly build up my understanding of it as I go along? Yeah. Remove all that extra shit that could cause issues for you, that could create a barrier from actually learning the tech that you're trying to learn. Okay, well, maybe I'll do the lecture tomorrow. I'll talk to Joel and see if he wants to have that break tomorrow. I can do, Tuesday, Wednesday. still trying to figure out for tomorrow, for Wednesday morning, might be the same type of situation. Maybe I'll have your lecture at 11 or something instead. Who knows? But I'll let them figure out what the timing is for that, and I will talk to Joel and see if he wants to give up tomorrow's. Cool. Yeah, great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.